let's start with that, like this medium here. You're not just collecting your own blood and running tests. I think that might
No.
be illegal. But where are you getting the blood, and describe the characteristics of the blood that are going into your tests?
This is fresh, whole human blood, and there's a vendor up in Massachusetts called Research Blood Components, and they allow you to kind of send in an order form for the type of blood collection you want. So, whether that's fresh whole blood, which is what we're using, just red blood cells, just plasma, that sort of thing. Um, and also, so, when you go to the doctors and you get your blood collected, in that vacutainer, there are reagents that act on that blood in different ways to preserve it or to keep it in a certain state. So we wanted that to also mimic what would be going into the product long term. So in this case, it's EDTA, which is an anticoagulating agent. So it just keeps that blood in n- a nice usable liquid state. So that's the way it comes to me, and then I kind of do on bench in a very, like, sciency manner, some chemical processes that would be done in the assay itself. So that's getting it another level to the state we would expect. So it's not just coming straight out of that tube. There's reagents that, limit foaming, and there's some chemical lysis that's also going on prior to the mechanical lysis.
Are you specifying a certain blood type, or, patient age, or, and if so, or if not, how are you sort of managing the variation of the different types of blood?
Right. So blood is definitely sensitive to each individual person. Like, no two people are going to have exactly the same blood with exactly the same characteristics. But long term, the product's going to have to accept really the wide range of blood. So rather than controlling that, we're kind of controlling to have the full range. So making sure they're collecting from multiple volunteers and we're not specifying anything that would come back to bite us later with some weird variation.
If you, as an engineer, are running kind of engineering testing showing that you're meeting certain mixing or flow control requirements, what sort of validation are you looking for from your, collaborative partner on the client side that is like the specialist in the science?
The scientists at our client teams are usually very well versed in these assays. They're doing them on bench in a lab by hand. So they're very useful resources both before and during testing. So before getting protocols reviewed, they can give you tidbits about things that you might not have considered that are really important to control, or things that you shouldn't worry about as much, like, after this step, you can wait a few minutes. If you have to go and set up a prototype, this is a good time to wait. Or after this step, this is not a good time to wait. It's very time sensitive. So they have that kind of first person experience with these protocols to help you kind of suss out things that otherwise you would have just had failures of testing and then realized and, learned from your mistakes. So they've kind of already made some mistakes and learned for you. So that's really helpful. And then also during testing, we're very collaborative with the client team. So I'm able to ping people and say, I just saw this result, send over pictures, send over videos. Um, what do you think's going on? And have that kind of informal back and forth, which really expedites the process of testing, rather than waiting for the next weekly technical meeting and having a more formal presentation. It's able to kind of get that um, quick, feedback, like, "This is something we've seen before, don't worry about it," or, "That's totally new, we should jump on a call and figure that out before you do more tests."
Have you used an analog to blood at all?
Yeah, we used an analog for blood in kind of the early de-risking of this design, and the insight from that is that all the blood analog really did for us was mimic the viscosity, it didn't mimic any other fluidic behaviors. And there's probably multiple blood analogs out there, so it might be more specific to the one we used, but we didn't see this foaming. We didn't really see, um, you're not able to mimic the changes from chemistry. So, adding reagents only really adds volume and changes the composition of the viscosity rather than having a chemical reaction and having that effect. So the blood analog was useful in that, like, in some ways, there's less control over where and how we must use it. It can show you just baseline, how is a thicker viscosity fluid going to act, but it didn't give us kind of the whole picture.
Got it. So it could be used probably for early proof of maybe fluidic circuit, but you just have
Right.
to be wary of these odd behaviors that don't match your intuition, as you said originally.
For sure.
Um, in your experience, what is the right framework or approach for, um, for developing the test? Basically, how do you start and iterate as you go through, all the way to the end, like we've talked about, validating what you're getting with your scientific partners?
Sure. So, I guess a great place to start with really any microfluidics exercise is an analytical model. But in this particular case with blood, it does have even more limitations, especially for people who don't have like PhD level backgrounds with fluid dynamics, which I do not. So, you can do a very good job with a pretty simple first principles model to understand the driving fluidics of that system. So, the fluidic resistance of a particular channel, what kind of pressures you're going to get in the system if you're driving at a flow rate, very kind of the simple, highest level of the science. But diving any further into that without doing experimental testing is really kind of an academic rabbit hole. And when you're working in a product design environment, you don't usually have the time or the budget to do that. So you want to quickly kind of move into prototype testing and just doing iterations of that testing, and getting a variety of designs out there for testing right away. So, if you have kind of a core design, but you're unsure about a certain feature, a certain design choice, so, kind of thinking through those higher level design architecture questions instead of doing a lot of theoretical thinking about that, it's pretty quick to just spin things up with like a quick turn 3D printing vendor and then test those in kind of a real application. So that's kind of my next step. And you would want to do that with water or a blood analog first. You don't want to jump right into blood just because there are logistic complications with getting blood. And once a prototype touches blood, it has to be in the lab and that sort of thing. So it'll give you more flexibility if you kind of run checkout testing with, water or a more common fluid first, and then jumping into blood. Maybe you've narrowed down your designs a little bit, maybe you haven't, but the blood testing itself will really give you more information about pain points in that particular design or places where blood is far more sensitive than you expected.
What data are you collecting with, water, let's say? Like, what are you looking for,
Sure.
to help validate that high level model before you start moving into using actual blood? What are you looking for?
Right. So, I mean, it totally depends on the cartridge that you're checking out what you're looking for. But part of what you're looking for is uh, the fluid moving as you would expect. So, staying in nice slugs, being actuated well by whatever method you're using to generate pressure differentiations, you know, and in most cartridges, unless you have an unlimited space, there's going to be turns and serpentines and that sort of thing. And so, is fluid getting caught up at turns or at junctions where you're changing diameter? That sort of thing, And then the more practical, like higher level mechanical things that you're looking for are like, is your coupon actually staying together? Like, are there like physical design things that need to be improved? And doing all that prior to getting into blood definitely makes things easier. So if we had jumped straight into blood, we wouldn't have necessarily known that that was a mechanical problem solely, right? It might have been more difficult to separate out those variables.
Describe how you've used video, or I assume you're using video to, evaluate, your test setup and share results. How are you using video?
Sure. So, yeah, every test I'm doing, my iPhone is set up on a little stand and it is taking video of the entire test. And, that's as much for me as it is for the client. When I want to go back and reflect and, kind of see the nuances that I couldn't see in real time, those videos are irreplaceable resource for, kind of tracking your testing with as much detail as you could possibly want. I mean, notes and like classic test reports are great, but to be able to go to other engineers on the project and show them exactly what happens expedites that debugging process a lot rather than me trying to recount something. And, human memory is never perfect. So trusting my memory to um, remember every single detail about that test is not really feasible, especially when you're running multiple tests a day and you're trying to um, look for small deviations between different test conditions. Having a video of that test is really important. And also, things that you're looking for in your observations might not align with what the client is looking for at the time. So, you know, I might be worried about things, nuances with my design, and they might be really worried about sound because from a marketing perspective, the sound is, you don't want a very noisy device sitting on someone's lab bench. So you're able to kind of remove any biases about what I'm looking for versus, what someone might be looking for now or in the future.
So you also raised a good point in that response, which is good enough. So describe in your words when you're handling blood in an automated test bed that will ultimately be in an integrated, regulated device. What is good enough for you? Because you're always going to be having these, bubbles or variation in mixing, things like that. How do you know when your design is good enough? To sort of have the confidence to build on, added features before or after, or, take the program to the next phase.
So what's good enough in a de-risking phase is not the same as what's good enough in an alpha phase. So, when you first get that design on the test bed, good enough might be it doesn't fall apart and make terrible noises. But in a few months, everyone's going to want a little bit more than that. So it comes back to just like having open communication with your partners at the client side and making sure that you're kind of all on the same page about what you're looking for and what's gating moving to that next step. And if you're working by yourself and you don't have a client, maybe you're a startup, defining those things out front of jumping into the testing will definitely make it easier to help you not fall into a rabbit hole of trying to run down every little bug um, that pops up. Because especially with working with blood, um, academically, it's a very interesting fluid. Like me and Ben are one of our other more senior engineers. Uh, Often saw things that we were like, if we were PhD students, we would want to spend a bunch of time doing testing and figuring that out. But at the end of the day, our success criteria of being able to get that fluid out of the chamber wasn't really affected by that cool fluidic thing we saw. So, it's not something that we needed to run down for that reason.
More specifically, in your case, like good enough would be you've mitigated bubbles, for example, as best you can,
Mhm.
given the constraints of the overall system, and flow control is adequate. The data from the science side is checking out, and you're ready to proceed to the next phase of development.
Right. And
Yeah,
because, at Keytech, we're not lab scientists, we don't necessarily have all the equipment our clients do. So they do get prototypes from us in this case to do testing so that they can, do post science processing and chemistry to find out actually if the blood is lysing, they're able to run assays that can suss that out. Whereas we can really just see, okay, are we able to recover 90% of the blood that we put in there? That's all we can really say from an engineering perspective. And so we lean on them to get the quantitative results of like performance of that particular design.
sure. Yeah, and that's an important handoff too. I mean, because you
Yeah.
need that insight before you can keep doing more testing or go to the next iteration, design iteration.